My mother, Rekha Basu, who lives in New Delhi, India, just left last week after a month in Des Moines. She comes here for her annual pilgrimage every year. She lives in India, and most of my childhood we lived in New York because she was with the United Nations, but after she retired from the UN, she and my father moved back to India. But they love Des Moines, love Des Moines. And they've always gravitated here because of the people. Not just because of me, not just because of my kids, but because of the people. My mother's in her 80s, and she's a very sociable person. And she collects people the way some people collect seashells. I mean, she just kind of gathers them around. And I'll come home from work at the end of the day, and there'll be this strange woman sitting in my living room eating cake with my mother, and I'll say, "Who is that?" later, and she'll say, "Oh, well, you know, she liked the same movie I did, and so, you know, here she is." I invited her over. And in fact, there have been so many Iowans that at last count I stopped at 50 who have met her, fallen in love with her, and gone to stay with her in India. I would be really surprised if there isn't at least one person in this audience who hasn't gone and stayed with her in India, because usually whatever crowd I'm in, there's someone who's done that. So her experience of Iowa has been overwhelmingly positive, as was my father's. But it's also the reason why I decided to stay here. When I moved here some 19 years ago, I was immediately struck by how amazing the people were. They were just really fun and classy, and I noticed that in 7 months here, I made more quality friendships than I had in 17 years in Albany, New York, where I had been living before this. It was just something about the people that I thought was really just charming and enchanting and wonderful, and they were all incredibly welcoming to me. But I'm sorry to say that not everybody's experience, not every newcomer's experience of Des Moines has been quite so positive. And one thing that greatly surprised me is soon after I moved here, the Des Moines Register ran a poll, an Iowa poll. And the question it asked was, do you think there's enough diversity in Iowa? Now, mind you, at the time, Iowa was 96.4% white. And overwhelmingly, people responded, "Oh yeah, plenty. We've got Germans, we've got the Norwegians, we've got the Dutch. You know, what else do you need? Who needs more diversity?" So I was kind of a little bit miffed by that, but I also knew that we were hearing anecdotally about people who were really feeling the effect of that attitude. We had newspaper stories about companies that we were trying to recruit, that Iowa's government was trying to recruit to come here, and they didn't want to relocate here because there wasn't enough diversity and because employees of color wouldn't feel comfortable here. And we had some companies who actually packed up and left for that reason. And we had, even though we had this wonderful refugee services relocation program, there were entire nationality groups that had come here, relocated as refugees, that chose not to stay here, even though they had homes here, because they felt quite unwelcome. And I'm thinking about the Sudanese, I'm thinking about the Somalis. They moved to other parts of the country, and some of them even moved north to Minnesota. You would think that they'd moved to a warmer climate, you know, where it was more like home, but no, they just moved to places where they felt demographically better represented and better connected. Now, I know that some Iowa cities have done a really wonderful job of trying to welcome in newcomers. When I first moved here, in fact, Dubuque was making the national news because it had established this diversity welcoming committee, and they were actually trying to recruit more African Americans to Dubuque. But living in New York, the storyline that I heard was that the KKK was marching on Dubuque, Iowa. And so I thought, oh my God, what a horribly racist place that must be if the KKK is marching. I didn't understand why it was marching. It was marching because Dubuque had done something really positive and forward-looking and was trying to get more people of color here. And Perry has done a similar effort. A lot of smaller communities where there's been an influx have tried to do things to make people feel welcome. But I've also interviewed a number of people of color in various Iowa towns, as well as in Des Moines, who say they feel extremely unwanted here. And in some smaller towns, I've actually seen people of color who have broken down and cried and said for some reason the way that they dress, the way that they talk, and the way that they worship is absolutely not appreciated, and they're extremely stigmatized for it, and actually nobody wants to be their friends. And you can see the de facto desegregation in Des Moines also on many different levels. You see it in the housing patterns. There's actually such a thing as white flight in Des Moines, even though there's so few people of color to flee from if you wanted to go to the suburbs and get away from them. And you can see it in the absence of people in the halls of power here, in the appointed government boards and in commissions and in the elective offices and in the corporate boardrooms. And then you also see it socially. I have to say it's very seldom that I go to a social gathering, a party given by someone who's white, and see more than one face of color at most. And the same is true, I think, vice versa. I recently met a woman, and she's originally from Turkey, although she's lived most of her life in the United States. And she's been in Iowa, in Des Moines, for a couple of years. And she's actually had a really rough time of it. She moved here because of her husband's job. And she's well educated, she's beautiful. You would think that people would really want to gravitate towards her. But first the problem started in school. They were making fun, kids were making fun of her son because he has a different name, because he's small, because his skin is darker. And then she told me that she feels that people just are not interested in her. They treat her as a foreigner because she has an accent, even though she's lived in America for most of her life. And this is from an email that she wrote to me. She said, "I feel this is a very closed community. People here have extended families living close by, and they do not need to make any outside and different friends. There were no neighbors, no parents at school or work reaching out to us to make this our home." She said, "At a PTA meeting, I sat in a table full of people, and within 2 minutes, they went and sat with people they knew, leaving me alone at the table. I went home and cried. I signed up for volunteering at the end of the year party, but nobody ever even gave me a call." And it made me really sad to hear her story. And in a way, this whole thing is very baffling to me because it's not the Iowa I know or experience personally. My family and I left here after living in Iowa for 10 years because we both got job opportunities in Florida, my husband and I, both as columnists in South Florida. And on paper, it all sounded wonderful down there: the weather, the oceans, the palm trees, the beach, the swimming pool in the backyard, and the multiculturalism. And so we went there thinking, not that there was anything wrong with Iowa, but that we had been here 10 years and we weren't really Iowans and we never really came here intending to stay, so might as well go where there was a great opportunity in this great new place. And we very quickly discovered that it was really pretty much all smoke and mirrors down there. That there was no real there, no center of community, just a collection of suburbs strung together by a highway and a lot of gated communities. And that people were extremely segregated, even though there were communities of color like Haitian and Cuban, they'd very much kept to themselves. But at least there was a critical mass that there were enough of them to be able to keep to themselves. And we decided we really, really missed Iowa. We missed the sense of community here. We missed the sense of investment that people have in going to city council meetings or school board meetings and voicing their opinions. In reading the newspaper and contacting the reporter or the columnist and trying to engage in a conversation as if you really have a personal stake in what's being said. And in that sort of sense of civic responsibility that showed up during the great floods, when people would stand in line for hours waiting for water and they wouldn't complain, as they definitely would have in New York City, and they would sandbag just voluntarily to do a good thing. And my husband and I just really missed Iowa, and we decided to come back. And this is a little anecdote about how glaring it was. My parents came down to visit us when we first moved to Florida. We were there for a year, and my father used to write poetry. And he used to sort of gather us around at the end of the day and say poetry time and do a little poetry reading about what he had written that day. And so the first time he came to see us in South Florida, he said, "Okay, poetry time," and we were all really excited because, he was going to be talking about how lovely our new home was and how well we had integrated with the community. Well, he sat us down and read us this poem, and it was about the city without a soul. He said South Florida had no soul. He said, "Iowa is where you belong. Iowa has a soul." And indeed, he was right. It did. And we came back. And this is what I've observed. Iowans, I think, are extremely charitable and giving people, and it's not at all uncommon to see Iowans through church groups and other civic organizations take up collections to help people who are in need. Every time I write a column about someone who's having a hardship, a number of checks come in for that person, just at random from complete strangers. And when it comes to people who are refugees or immigrants, there is definitely that sense of wanting to give, of wanting to help. I see a lot of that. But what I'm talking about here today is not about helping people. I'm really talking about engaging with them. Where is our sense of curiosity, our sense of excitement and eagerness to meet people who come from very different backgrounds than we do? Although I won't say are different from us, because many of them end up being really quite a lot like us inside. Aren't we curious when someone comes from a different country about what their practices are around marriage or education or child rearing? Why don't we ask more questions? Why don't we go out of our way to try and engage with them? And you know, it's okay to go to things like the Asian Heritage Festival at Gray's Lake once a year and sample the egg rolls, but that's not what I'm talking about. And it's okay and it's wonderful to go to the I'll Make Me a World celebration and see something about African American culture, but that's not what I'm talking about. It's not the same to be in the role of observer as it is to be connected. I think there are many reasons why we stay separate. I think prejudice is certainly one of them, and I hear about that a lot in the emails that I get from people, especially the ones that talk about the president of the US and use the N-word, and the people who say that the Latinos should go back to where they came from, that I should go back to where I came from if I wrote something that they didn't like. But I don't think that's the main reason, at least not for most people. I think one of the things that the Turkish woman said is very true, that people have long-standing friendships and communities, people who they went to school with and college with, who they tend to stay friends with, or it's around sports teams. But I also think that there's a fear factor. And I think that that fear factor actually goes both ways. There's certainly a fear on the part of the incoming minority person of reaching out to the larger community. It's scary. You don't know if you know the right customs, if you know the right things to say, if you can connect with them around things that are important like sports teams and so on. And I first got wind of this fear factor when there was a diversity training session held in our office at the newspaper, and a colleague said something that really surprised me. He said it never even occurred to him to invite an African-American colleague who was a newcomer to town to his house for dinner, because he just made the assumption that they would only want to be with other African-Americans. And you know, when I think about it, I'm sort of guilty of some of the same kind of compartmentalizing in my own life, as I suspect that most of us are. If you come to a dinner party at my house, you'll see a lot of people of different ethnic groups and people from different religious backgrounds and countries. You won't necessarily see a lot of elderly people there unless my mother is in town. You won't see people of her age that much. And it's not that I don't love them. I love her friends. I find them really engaging and interesting. But at some level, I think that I'm afraid that they wouldn't appreciate my style of entertaining, that they wouldn't think that I serve the right kind of food or serve it in the way that they'd like it served. And that's really a mistake on my part, because I know that they'd enjoy coming, and I'm going to do something about changing that. And so finally, this is what I would really like you to think about as you leave here today. I'd like you to find someone who's of a different culture, a different demographic, a newcomer to town, someone who appears on the surface to be somewhat unlike you, and someone who is sitting at that metaphorical school lunch table alone. And try to think about approaching them, not as an act of charity. Think about approaching them in conversation, and think about inviting them for a cup of coffee, or better yet, invite them to your house. Invite them to your house for dinner, and introduce them to some of your friends. And think about engaging them in your book club, or your women's club, or men's club, or whatever activities you do. Think about reaching out beyond your comfort zone. I think you'll actually really expand your horizons. I can't guarantee you that you'll get an invitation to stay in someone's home in India. But I can guarantee you that you'll be taking a great step toward knocking down the walls that keep our community separate, and that you'll be very rewarded by it personally. Thank you so much.